A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shiloh, Rabbi David Bar Chaim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar Chaim.
Shalom.
Why is it that nearly all of the proponents of the idea of re-establishing a Jewish state in the land of Israel were secular in their orientation rather than religious?
There are at least two major points that need to be made in order to deal with this question properly. The first is that which Rav Kook alludes to in his famous essay, Le'malach ha'ideyot b'Yisrael. This is a very unique and profound essay that was published in a certain magazine during Rav Kook's lifetime, in which he explains that the two central concepts and themes in Judaism, that is to say, the religious ideal and the ideas that pertain to the connection of the human being in general to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the Creator, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the national idea, the nationalistic idea and expression of those religious ideals. These two areas of Jewish life are supposed to work together in a harmonious and congruous way in order to produce a healthy and symbiotic relationship between all areas of existence. This reality was achieved in the time of David HaMelech and his son Shlomo HaMelech, the time of the building of the first Mikdash. However, as we know, that golden period did not last for very long, and things began to unravel. And eventually the Jewish people found themselves in exile in Babylon. And from that time onwards, there was a disconnect between the religious ideal in Judaism and the nationalistic ideal in Judaism. That is to say, even when some of the Jewish people returned during the period of the Second Temple and re-established some kind of Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and eventually this even became a Jewish commonwealth for a period of about 100 years under the Hashmonaim, nevertheless, the Jewish people remained to a large degree in what I refer to as Galut mode Judaism. This was the kind of Judaism that was developed over a long period of time, over a period of nearly 1500 years, from the time of the destruction of the first Mikdash up to and including the time of the redaction of the Talmud about 1,000 years later, and in fact even some hundreds of years beyond that, to the time of the end of the period of the Geonim, approximately the year 1000 according to the Gregorian calendar. For that very long period of 1500 years, the balance of power, so to speak, in the Jewish world shifted in favor of the exilic Jewish existence in Bavel, in Babylon and surrounding countries, and a certain version of Jewish existence and Jewish thought and Jewish religious practice grew up and was developed in Bavel, as we find in the Talmud Bavli, which was suited and ideal for that reality of Galut, of living as a minority in a non-Jewish land, in exile, surrounded by non-Jewish cultures. The emphasis was on the individual, on the community, but not on the nation, because there was in practice no nation. And in general, the sages of the Second Temple period onwards understood that the individual Jew needed to strengthen his personal, individual connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his appreciation of spiritual and higher things than material existence only, and therefore the emphasis was placed on directing the hearts and minds of Jews to the spiritual, to the edifying, and not to the mundane and the worldly. And as a result of these different historical factors and psychological and educational patterns, as a result of all this, the Jewish people shifted away from a kind of normative earthly existence as described in the Tanakh, where, after all, the Tanakh in Sefer Shemot, in chapter 19, Perek Yud Teth, just before the giving of the Torah, defines the purpose of the Jewish people on earth as being a Mamlechet Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom, of course, refers to what we refer to nowadays in modern parlance as a state, and therefore this implies a system of thought, a philosophy of life, an attitude towards Jewish existence and human existence in general, which knows how to make sense of both the physical and material realm, as well as the spiritual and philosophical and psychological realm. And that is the essential symbiotic, harmonious, congruous relationship that the Torah wishes for us to aspire to and directs us towards. However, in the Galut, all this began to unravel, and the emphasis was constantly placed on the spiritual and not on the material, and certainly nothing to do with nation building and being a Mamlechet Kohanim, being a kingdom, being a nation, a state of some kind. All this was forgotten over this very long period of time. And therefore, the Jews who came from that kind of background, from the religious world, with a religious upbringing, essentially knew nothing about the concept of a Mamlechet Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. In other words, the aspect of nationhood of the Jewish people and their purpose on earth was entirely forgotten. And I can relate to you here a story that I've mentioned on other occasions, but I think it bears repetition. And that is that some years ago, when I was invited to speak in a certain home at the Shabbat table, where I was the guest, and this home had some Chabad affiliations, and it happened to be Parashat Yitro, which is the parasha where the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, are to be found. And just prior to those Aseret HaDibrot, as I mentioned, we find this pasuk, Vatem Tilu Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. That was the Shabbat that I found myself in this situation. I was asked to say a Dvar Torah, and I explained that we find in this week's parasha that the Torah commands us, the Jewish people, to establish a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And the basis for what I'm saying, I explained, is the pasuk that we learned, that we read today in the Torah, Va'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. I explained the word mamlacha in the Torah, in the Tanakh, which means a kingdom, is the term that is synonymous with what we today call a state. And that is the meaning of the Torah. That is the purpose of the Jewish people on earth. Immediately, one of the younger members of the family, a yeshiva bocher, who was at the table, jumped up and said, I've never ever heard it said to me that there is a mitzvah in the Torah for us to establish a state in the land of Israel. And my response to him was that I'm sure you've never heard it. I have no doubt, because this is not something that people hear about. This is not something that people are taught in those institutions where you have studied Torah. But that is what the Torah is telling us. In other words, we have the norm and the standard laid down by the Torah, the divine intention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as to what the Jewish people should direct themselves towards in this world. And we have the reality of Judaism as it developed in the abnormal state of exile, of Galuth, and the result is a complete lack of awareness that this part of the Torah even exists. This is one part of the problem. The concept of a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh is at the very basis and is absolutely essential to a proper understanding of Torah Judaism. And I will at this point quote from the essay by Rav Kook that I mentioned, L'malach ha'ideyot b'Yisrael. In Sefer Oroth by Rav Kook, on page 104, Kof Daled, we find the following statement. Rav Kook writes that Bereshith mata'o shel ha'am hazeh, at the very beginning of the formation of the Jewish people, nitgalatha ha'shi'ifa lahakim tzibur enoshi gadol. There appeared the aspiration to establish a large human polity that would walk in the ways of Hashem. Asher yishmor derech Hashem la'asov tzedakah u'mishpat. Rav Kook continues to say, Zoya ha'she'ifa, this purpose and this aim and this aspiration, sheba'a mikoach ha'hakara ha'berura v'he'azah v'atviya musarit ha'kolelet harama. This desire and this aspiration, which have their root in a great moral and philosophical ideal, which is Lohotzi et ha'enoshut mitachat sevel nora, to remove and to save the humanity from its suffering, shel tsarot ruhaniyot v'chomriyot, from spiritual and physical sufferings, ulahaviena lahayeh hofesh mile'eh hod ve'eden, and to show it the way towards living a full and glorious existence here on earth, be'or ha'ideh ha'elohit, with the aid of the connection to the religious ideal, the connection to Hashem. Lehatzliach bazer kol ha'adam kulo, and this will lead to pointing the way towards the success and fulfillment of all human beings. Rav Kook continues and goes on to say as follows: Lemilu'ah shel she'ifa zo, it is necessary to achieve this, צריך דווקא שציבור זה יהיה בעל מדינה פוליטית וסוציאלית וכיסא ממלכה לאומית. It is necessary, it is essential that such a group of people, such a nation, have their own state, בעל מדינה פוליטית, a political, social and sovereign existence of their own, with the highest expression of human culture, etc. So Rav Kook writes here, because by so doing they will show the way and point in the direction that all nations must follow in order to achieve the ideal state of existence and life for all of humanity. And that is exactly what Yeshayahu, of course, refers to in the famous pasuk: the Jewish people are to be a light to the nations, or lagoyim. The trouble with all of this is that if these concepts and this ideal, this essential purpose of the Jewish people on earth is somehow forgotten as a result of the Galut reality, and as a result of the deliberate educational plan and the deliberate emphasis placed by the Chachamim from the Second Temple period onwards, due to the bitter experience of the First Temple period, where the majority of the people fell into ways of Avodah Zarah, etc., and moved further and further away from Hashem. And the conclusion of the Nevi'im and their followers and their students, that is to say Chazal, was that we must strengthen the spiritual aspects of human existence, of the individual first of all, in order for the nation to be able to fulfill its aim. The individual Jew also has to be strengthened first as an individual. He has to be shown that that which is above and beyond the physical world is the most important parts of human existence and Jewish existence, and therefore they stressed these aspects of the Torah more than the national aspects of the Torah. As a result of all of this, the Jewish people essentially forgot who they are and what their purpose on earth was. And therefore it was only to be expected that when the time came for Hashem to begin to lead the Jewish people out of the Galuth, it would have to be through the agency of people who had not been influenced by what became normative Judaism, even though in fact it is the opposite of the Torah norm, and yet this had become normative Judaism, this Galut-based reality. Only Jews who had been able to remove themselves from this appreciation of Jewish existence and life could begin to view things in a different light. And in fact, even though they were coming from a secular perspective, in certain areas their thinking was more in line with the original intention of the Torah, and this we find in the realities, the political and historical realities, as they developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, so that the main impetus, the main drive, and those who the major proponents of the Zionist thinking and the need for establishing a Jewish state in the land of Israel did not come from the Torah world, but rather from those who found themselves rather distant from the Torah world, who in fact were convinced that such ideas of Jewish nationhood and sovereignty in the land of Israel had nothing to do with the Torah, which of course is entirely spurious. And yet it was a forgivable mistake, because it was true that in the Jewish world as they experienced it, these ideas were unknown, just as this idea was unknown at that Shabbat table where I spoke so many years ago. In this connection, I wish to quote also from the famous book Masilat Yesharim by the Ramchal, which I have before me in addition, which combines both versions of the book that the Ramchal wrote. Most people do not know that the Ramchal actually wrote the book first, the Masilat Yesharim, as a kind of dialogue based on the style of writing and discussing ideas that we find first in the dialogues of Plato, which was also came into vogue once again in Renaissance Italy, etc. So when the Ramchal, who lived in the 1700s in Italy, he was familiar with this style. He wrote the book Masilat Yesharim first as a kind of dialogue between two people presenting different points of view, and then he wrote a second version, which is the more well-known version, which is the more plain, straight presentation of the material without any kind of dialogue. In the first version, which is the more comprehensive and more explanatory and more clear, I think, in many ways, the clearer of the two versions, the Ramchal writes at the beginning of Masilat Yesharim as follows. He brings a midrash from Yilkut Shimoni, Parashat Bereshit, Remez Kof Yod Aleph. And there we have the following quote, and I read from the Masilat Yesharim. The midrash says, Kishayu Yaakov wa Esau b'ma'e iman. When Yaakov and Esau, the twins who were born to Yitzchak Avinu, were in their mother's womb. Amar lo Yaakov le'Esau, Ahi, shnei olamot lefanenu. My brother, there are two worlds ahead of us that we're about to meet in our future lives. Olam hazeh and olam haba. In olam hazeh you have achila and shatiya, eating and drinking and doing business and making a living and getting married and having children, etc., etc. And olam haba is a very different reality. You don't have all these aspects of life in this world do not exist there. And I suggest that we make the following deal. You take for yourself olam hazeh and I will take olam haba. That is the quote that the Ramchal brings here in his book, and then he goes on to say, therefore, we, the descendants of Yaakov, we were not created for this world. It is not our portion, it is not designed for us, it is designed for Esau, who here represents the nations of the world. Our purpose is a different purpose. So the Ramchal writes in Masilat Yesharim. And this is not unique to Masilat Yesharim. I simply quote from the Masilat Yesharim because it is a universally learnt and respected work, as it should be. But it is necessary to understand that he represents in this book the philosophy and the Hashkafat Olam, the Weltanschauung, if you like that term, that the Jewish people are not really designed for this world at all, and our essential and only real home is Olam Haba, and we're only here, as it were, as sojourners passing through and doing the best we can whilst we're here, but this is not really where we belong at all. With that kind of approach to this world, to Olam Hazeh, I think it is very difficult to convey a concept of the Jewish people's destiny and purpose in this world as described in the Torah, namely to be a Mamlechet Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh, to be an exemplary nation, a sovereign nation living in its own land, which of course implies and requires and necessitates all aspects of governance and military prowess, technological knowledge and success and economic progress, etc., and all manner of cultural achievements in the realms of music, poetry, writing, etc., etc. All these aspects of Olam Hazeh, as it were, the higher and the lower aspects of this world, are part and parcel of the Jewish, the essential Torah description, Hashem's description of who the Jewish people are and what they are supposed to achieve in this world. But if you develop an attitude towards this world, which essentially is one of disdain and contempt and certainly of distaste for this world, it is very difficult to explain to your students that the Jewish people's purpose is to be a sovereign nation on this earth and to develop an exemplary Torah-based society here in this world. And therefore no one should be surprised if when when the notion of Haredi Bachurei Yeshiva having to serve in the army is suggested to the Haredi community, no one should be surprised. They don't, in fact, understand at all what it is people want from them. They can't possibly fathom, what on earth are you talking about? Why should we be spending our time, why should our young men, instead of dealing with things to do with Olam Haba, sitting in yeshiva and learning Masechet Yevamot, or reading Tehillim, you want them to go and play soldiers in an army like Goyim? You want them to deal with Olam Hazeh? That's entirely not what we're designed for. That's not what we're here for. That's not our purpose on earth. And therefore they truly do not understand this this demand. They think it is entirely incomprehensible and completely illegitimate. And therefore no one should be surprised that just last night, as I read today in the Jerusalem Post, there were protests in Mea Sharim against the suggestion that Yeshiva Bocha should go to the army. But according to the Torah, that is exactly what the Torah tells us. It does, after all, tell us in the Torah, Ki tetzeh lemilchama al oivecha, when you go out to war against your enemies. The Torah was talking about that kind of existence, and not the galut mode Jewish existence that most Jews today, religious Jews, are used to, and they are convinced that is the only type of existence that is of any value, of any meaning, and any suggestion to the opposite is anathema to them. As we find in the book Vayoel Moshe by the Rebbe Misatnar, Rabbi Yoel Teichelboim, who, in response to the suggestion that the Geulah simply means the Jewish people returning to Eretz Yisrael and rebuilding the land and living according to the Torah, rather than some kind of supernatural, miraculous existence above and beyond that, he finds it necessary to write a tirade against such a notion, because his conception of Geulah, of redemption, and what we are aiming for is entirely different and divorced from such an earthly reality. And therefore the philosophy of Jewish life and existence, as found in some of these texts, is such that it does not conduce to any kind of wholesome, healthy, and constructive, harmonious reality within the Jewish world, of which combines within it and knows how to relate to all aspects of human and Jewish existence, the material, the spiritual, and the psychological. That is the norm to which we must return, as opposed to the abnormal state the Jewish people became accustomed to in the Galut.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar Chaim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar Chaim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.